So I present at a handful of meetings and conferences around the country, and I really like doing these cons, especially the ones in the Midwest, because it allows us to sort of talk about research that either that we're currently working on, or allows us to get feedback from people that are actually in the field doing the work, and allows us to talk about some theoretical things, some things that we're seeing, things that we're tracking, things that we're working on. It allows us to get interaction on whether this research is interesting to the industry and people who are working in IT and security, or whether we're just sort of going off into a little rabbit hole that's only interesting for us. So before I start, even though I'm one half of the two people that did the research on this presentation, I do want to take a second to thank Dr. Ken Gears, who was working at FireEye when we were doing this research, but he has moved on to another country and another company. But I want to make sure that I credit him for a lot of the hard work on this and not make it seem like I did all of the work myself. So quick background about myself. I'm a threat analyst for FireEye. So what that means is basically I go and talk to customers about what the threats are to them. Most importantly, why are they being targeted? What are we seeing from a technology standpoint? But more importantly, why are they particularly being targeted? So before that, I spent 6 years in the CIA in Washington, D.C. I was a cyber analyst for the CIA. My role there was similar to what I'm doing now in the private sector, but it's more of who is attacking the U.S. government and why. So which countries are trying to attack the U.S. government? What's the technology that they're using? And more importantly, what are they trying to do with the data from a political and an economic standpoint? What are they trying to do with that data? So I've been there about 6 years, presented at a handful of conferences. I focus mainly on Russia and Eastern Europe, but I also did some time working on organized crime, not doing organized crime, but studying organized crime, and also China and Iran and some of those other countries as well. So presented at a handful of workshops, and some of the work that I had done was included in President Obama's daily briefing. So the idea behind our research, Ken and I were sitting around one day, and we were saying, you know, you hear a lot from the media and from government and from people in the industry, and you hear a lot of times that people talk about terrorism chatter. So there's an increase in some terrorism chatter. We know that there's terrorists talking to each other. We can see chatter. We don't know what they're saying, but we have a good idea that something is going to happen because there's an increase in chatter. And then there was another story that in the 80s and 90s, there was journalists and media folks who lived in Washington, D.C., and they would monitor the White House and the Pentagon. And whenever they saw an increase in amount of late-night food delivery trucks or pizza trucks going to the White House or pizza trucks going to the Pentagon, they had a good idea that something was going on. They couldn't tell what was going on, but they knew that something was going on. Same idea with the chatter. So we thought, you know, access to all of the data that we have for our company, all our customer callbacks and all the network traffic around the world, could we look at a year and a half's worth of data and see where that data is coming from and where that data is going to see if we could see any trends that are going on when we lay it over a geopolitical landscape. So the idea was, hey, we have, you know, 20, 30 million amounts of callbacks going to all these different countries. What if we look at which countries are talking to each other, and let's lay what's going on in the world, again, from a political aspect or a geopolitical aspect, and see, is there a correlation? Are there more hits coming to or from a country that's having an international situation with another country? So what we did is that's what we want to do. We took all of the data that we saw from 2013 and 2014, and the first thing that we wanted to do, the first part of this presentation, said, well, what sort of interesting things do we see in that data? You know, we took all a year's worth of data. What sort of interesting callback information are we seeing, whether it comes to domain names that actors are using, location that actors are using, infrastructure that they're using? So that'd be sort of the first part of the presentation. So the second part is going to be taking that data and doing two case studies, one on the Russian-Ukraine sort of incident that was going on, and the second one being the Israel-Gaza incident or situation, and then putting network traffic from both of those countries that we're seeing and laying them over a timeline of political events to see if there's any increase or decrease during these world events. Now, since we only have two areas that we covered, this is not sort of the end-all be-all of, if you see this, this country's about to invade this country. But our idea was, you know, callbacks don't get a lot of respect a lot of times. People just sort of talk about the malware, or they talk about who's been infected or what's been stolen. We thought, hey, wouldn't it be cool to look at actual callback information on the to and the from and see if there's any interesting data that we can pull out just from those callbacks. So the data itself and any sort of research you do, it's important to understand sort of the boundaries and the barriers of the data itself. So all of the data that we are using is coming from our customers. So that means there's two key points about this. One, it's hitting an industry or a company. So we don't work with home users. This is all companies. So actually industry, government, those sorts of things. And the customers agreed to share the data. So you can asterisk the data how you want. So this is not theoretical. So all the data that we're using, you know, the millions of callbacks, and I don't like to use the numbers of callbacks because you could sort of fidget those to however you want. But so this is not theoretical data. This was not, hey, we did some RE on a piece of malware and look at all the different places it could call back to. Or we figured out the domain generate algorithm of a piece of malware, and here's all the different domains that they could go to. Or look at all the different domains that were signed up. All the traffic that we looked at was actually malicious traffic that was being sent from an infected host to a command and control. And the way that we're sitting and the way that we're getting this data is we're sitting usually as close to the end users as possible. So after IPS, after IDS. So we really didn't want to say, you know, this piece of malware can call out to 20 million domains. We wanted to say, where are we seeing individual people being affected and where are they calling out to? So the first thing that we want to do is take all of the callbacks, so where these malicious, where this malware is calling out to, and put the places that the malware is going to on a map. And the interesting thing that we found out about that is first, the size of the circle indicates the number of callbacks going back to that area. So obviously the larger the circle, the more callbacks that were going to the area. So the interesting thing is when we put it on a map, we saw that almost every single country, province, and area in the world at some point received at least some piece of callback. So it's not just, you know, US, Russia, China that are sending and receiving this malicious traffic. It was almost every country that we had seen in the world. And when you put it on a map like this, I think it really highlights the difficult problem when it comes from a law enforcement perspective, number one, but also from an administrative perspective on how you stop something like this. So this shows you're not going to arrest your way out of this problem. You're not going to solve this problem with a simple piece of technology. Putting it on a map really wanted to show how big of a problem this is on malware that's calling back to different areas. And then we broke it down by individual pieces of malware, and the malware that calls back the most has a bigger circle. And I don't think it's really important to dive into each one of these pieces of malware, but I thought the important thing was to show when you take a snapshot of a company or you take a snapshot of an industry, this is the type of malware traffic that they have to deal with on a daily basis. You see all the different numbers of dots that are on there, so you could see how difficult a job it is to protect against any one piece of malware. So just so everyone's on the same page, when we talk about callbacks, machine gets infected, calls out to a command and control. That command and control, the information that it calls out to, it can have information about the victim. It could have information, requests for commands. It could be sort of a keep alive request. There's ones here that show, you know, base 64 encoded text that had the operating system or information about the victims. But what we really wanted to focus on for this presentation was not so much the data or the information that was going back and forth, but where was it going to and what sort of domains that they were using. And being in a company, we're fully aware of the argument that first stage hot points don't matter. People argued, we had a lot of internal fights that people said, well, if you see a country, a victim box in the United States going to Germany, it doesn't matter because Germany's not the endpoint for that data. It's going to go from Germany to 4 or 5 or 6 different places. So the first stage that a piece of malware is going to is irrelevant. So the argument against that was a couple of things. First, we wanted to say no one else is really looking at first stage callbacks. There's got to be something interesting in there. But secondly, we wanted to say, you know, not every piece of malware callback is super sexy Chinese hackers that have spent years and millions of dollars setting up infrastructure. Sometimes you will see a one-to-one. Sometimes there's enough data there that when you correlate it with what's going on in the world, it's enough to be interesting. So that we're fully aware of this is not where the data is ending up. So we broke it down by industry, and you can see the education industry by far had the largest amount of individual unique callbacks going to different places in the world. Government was number 2, healthcare number 3. The interesting about this, in 2013, healthcare was pretty far down the list when it comes to individual callbacks. But 2014, we saw, at the beginning of the first 5 or 6 months, we saw a skyrocket of the amount of unique places that the healthcare industry was starting to call back. Now, whether that's a change in malware, whether they're becoming more targeted is up for debate. But it was interesting that education had constantly stayed as a #1 place that was calling out to the most amount of places, but healthcare had quickly moved up to #2 or #3 in the rankings. And then we also saw this ebb and flow of callbacks by each industry over time. It started out with a dip at the first of the year, and then it slowly started creeping its way up in every single industry until around the end of April and early May. And then we saw a little bit of a dip, and then at the end of May, early June, the callbacks started to increase again. So I don't know, I haven't been able to correlate that to a botnet takedown, but it's interesting that every single industry we saw a decrease at one particular point in time, and then a slowly increase going back up from all the different industries. So then we broke down port numbers. So all this callback, this malware is calling back, our assumption was that all of it is using port 80. When we dug a little bit deeper into the malware, we saw that there was over 35,000 different ports that were being used to send out command and control communication. The majority of them, for obvious reasons, were port 53 and port 80 and port 8080. But the interesting thing is we saw a good amount that were port numbers in the 15,000. So what this said to us is it really showed how big of a problem zero-access malware was to a lot of companies. Because again, we're talking about companies and government, not individual home users. But you could see a huge amount of spike that we saw in zero-access that was using those high-level port numbers. But when looking at all the malware we looked at and all the different callbacks, it's answered our assumption that port 80 for the most part is where most of the malware was calling out to. So when we did sort of a deep dive on where this malicious traffic is going to, one of the interesting things that we saw is that it's going to, in some instances, it's going to education. So it's going to EDU sites or it's going to universities. And when we broke down the traffic, the malicious traffic that was going first stage hop to education and university, there was 3 departments of the education and universities that were receiving the majority of the malware callbacks. The first one was the library. Second one was the computer science department, imagine that. And then the third one was the School of Law in each one of these universities. So along with education, we saw a good amount of government.gov and government-based IPs that were receiving malware communication. Now, this doesn't mean that these were the attackers or these were the hackers, but most likely means that this infrastructure has been hacked into. So we had identified 25 different governments that were receiving first-stage malicious communication, with South America by far being the largest industry in the world that was receiving malicious communications. We also looked at country-to-country communication. So the idea was, do people want to stay in-house to hide in the noise? So where's the first place they go to when they leave the network? And what we saw is that 26% of the time, people stayed within the country of their victim on the first stage of the hop. Again, a hop to hide the noise. If you're in the US, you don't want to send your first stage to Russia. 26% of the time, they were sending it to the country that they were in. And then we sort of classified APT versus non-APT, which we could have a 9-month conference on what that is. But for 2013, we saw that APTs were calling back half the amount of time as traditional malware. And then in 2014, our small sample size, but 2014, we saw that APTs were calling out 7 times less than traditional malware. So we took an individual country like Korea, and we wanted to show out how often do they stay country to country. So you can see as this broke down by where this country was calling out to, the majority of the places that Korea was going to for a first hop, so victims in Korea, the most amount of time, they're staying in Korea for their first hop. Second place they're going to is US, et cetera, et cetera. So we also looked at the domains that these attackers were using to hide in the noise, and we found that there was so much spoofed domains being used out there. Just for a small sample size of 1 year, we saw over 200 different variations of Google, things like using the Q instead of the G. We saw 200 different variations of Firefox, using like Firefox Update, 50 different variations of Facebook, things like moving the A around or the O, hundreds and hundreds of different malicious domains that were using a Microsoft-related name. And then we saw a bunch of spoofed security websites and spoofed AV sites that were included as well. We've also seen a couple instances, not a large amount, but a good enough to discuss, that there was targeted callbacks. So the company that was infected, the callbacks were had the company's name that was being targeted in the domain name. So company xyz.noip.com or company y.whatever.com. So we saw a couple of instances where the company name itself was being used in the callback that was hacked into. So we took all the domain names and popped it up there looking for something sexy. Unfortunately, nothing really sexy jumped out. Report was used by far the most in any of the domains that we had seen. But we've also seen like honeypot, security, those sorts of things. A little disappointing, but I thought it was interesting to put all of them on there. So A quote from my favorite philosopher. This is great. There's a lot of data on there, but people can come up with statistics for anything. 40% of people know that. So what does this mean? So we have this information, we have all this data, so what can we actually do with this amount of data? So the first thing that we wanted to do is we wanted to put it on this map of, okay, where people are calling back to. And when we did a country-to-country analysis, we saw that globalization exists in callbacks as well. You can see these are all the different countries that are talking back to each other, and those outlining ones are ones that only that country is talking to. So when we looked at it on a map, almost every one of these countries are talking to each other. So globalization exists in business, globalization also exists in malware callbacks. And then we thought, okay, well, maybe it's the companies or the countries that have the most broadband that are calling out the most. You know, that would make the most sense. They have the most traffic. So we put all the different countries that we had seen on a command and control rank, and then also on the broadband rank. And while we did see companies that have a high percentage of broadband being used a lot for command and control servers, we did see outlying ones like Luxembourg, Virgin Islands. There were parts in Africa as well that didn't have a lot of broadband, but had a large amount of command and control communication. So we couldn't make the correlation that's only broadband rank that was talking of where people were using their infrastructure for. So we wanted to create a new map. We basically want to see on the right-hand side over here. So this is all the malware that is above the equator. So you can see there's an overwhelming amount of callbacks that were included above the equator, with the exception maybe in the healthcare industry and the government. I would say almost the majority of it was above the equator. And this one on the left is the prime meridian, running right through Earth. So you can see on the right-hand side, majority of the malware was on the right-hand side of the prime meridian. And with the exception of government, healthcare, and education, again, majority of it was on the right side. So we wanted to try and create a new map. And what we found is that overwhelming majority amount of the callback is going above the equator. And when we looked at each individual country on a heat map and how big each callback was, by far, the #1 country that was receiving and sending the most malware was the US. Doesn't help us politically or from a PR standpoint when we tell other countries to stop doing it, but from what we saw, the US was the #1 in receiving and sending malware. And not only were they #1 overall, but they were the #1 destination from almost every other single country that we had analyzed their malware for. So all the countries on the bottom we had seen, almost all of them, the #1 place that their malware was calling back to for a first stage hop was within the United States. The United States was also a big target. When it came to Russia, doesn't make, it's not that very shocking, but the #1 target of malware that was coming to Russia, the #1 country that was coming from was the United States by a very large margin. So we said, okay, well, let's look at this traffic going to and from Russia and to and from Ukraine throughout the year. And we saw an interesting spike in March. Well, let's see what happened in March. Nothing much except for the fact that the Russian parliament authorized the use of military force in Ukraine. Putin signed a bill incorporating Crimea Peninsula, freezing assets, troops on the border. March was a big deal for the Russian-Ukraine industry. So what we did is we took it by a month-by-month basis from 2013 and 2014 to see the amount of callbacks going to each one of these areas. And you can see in March, the amount of callbacks going to Russia had increased by a large amount from the previous month and in the entire year. It dropped down a little bit in April, but then it started to pick back up. And for Ukraine, Ukraine didn't move too much in March, but there was a steady increase from April, May, and June as we started seeing stepping it up. So as this conflict was escalating, we were seeing an increased amount of callback traffic going to both of these countries. And then we looked at countries that are calling out to Russia. Red was February, blue was March. Almost every single country that we had seen calling out to Russia, there was an increase in callbacks going out that peaked in March during a lot of the issues going on between Russia and Ukraine. So here's all the countries that we identified calling back to Russia. And you see almost in every single country, the amount of callbacks increased during March. It started to go down a little bit in April, but there was a steady stand out of the amount of callbacks going in when you look at a month-by-month basis, breaking down in March. And it wasn't just particular industries. So we broke down every single industry and just wanted to see, okay, is maybe all of this healthcare stuff, is it all financial data that's going to Russia? And almost every single industry that we identified, March had much higher the amount of callbacks going and coming from Russia than it did in February. So again, this is not to say that you can tell quickly of a conflict just by looking at callbacks, but it's another data point, something that we thought would be interesting to look at. And for Ukraine, around that time, we wanted to see the amount of unique countries that it's calling back to. So Ukraine had stayed pretty steady over the following months leading up to March, but in March, it had received callbacks from 10 additional unique countries that it hadn't received the month before. So we see an increase in callbacks. Russia was #7 on 8 countries that had not seen callbacks from before. So that's one country, one incident. What about another one? What happens if we take another incident like the Israel-Gaza? So we took on the left-hand side the Israeli victims. So these are people in Israel, victims, who are sending command and control traffic to these other countries. And you see the Israeli victims, the areas in red are areas that have a geopolitical conflict or issue with Israel. So a good amount, but not as many as some of the other areas. The C2 nodes are victims that are sending traffic to Israel. And again, the amount of reds is starting to increase. And then on the right-hand side, or all the way on the left-hand side, I guess up here, that is the both receiving and sending malicious traffic to and from Israel. And you can see the amount of countries that have a geopolitical conflict or issue with Israel had increased the most when we take both sides of the equation or both sides of the traffic. So around July is when the conflict had started to peak. So we looked at traffic that was coming to and from Israel. And again, we saw a decrease going through the years until the conflict had started. And when the conflict had started in July, we saw a large increase in amount of malicious traffic going and coming from Israel. We also broke it down by month and by location. So when we had looked at a variety of different pieces of malware, in May, we only saw onesie twosies of pieces of malware that were calling out to Israel, specifically from Canada, where we had, for some reason, seen a large amount of malware coming from Canada going to Israel. And then in June, we saw a couple more instances of random pieces of malware calling out to Israel as their command and control. And then when July hit, we saw an increased amount of individual pieces of malware, different pieces of malware, coming from different areas, coming from different countries, but an increase in those going towards Israel. So the idea behind it was not you can solve every issue or figure out international events by highlighting where malware communication is going to. But what we wanted to do is we wanted to start the process. We're going to try and release a white paper sometime between now and the time that I retire in 30 years on where we see an increase in callback and match it up from geopolitical events. The most difficult part about this is in a sort of an awkward, creepy way, you have to wait for a major event and then go back and look at the data from there. So it's something that we want to keep going and keep evolving. But when we took two large issues that happened in the world, the Russia, Ukraine, and the Gaza, Israel, there was enough information there on first stage callbacks that made it interesting to think, is this part of could we eventually over time be able to tell geopolitical events based on an increase in callbacks going towards or coming from an individual country? So that's about the time. There's my contact information if anyone wants any additional information, if you want to know when this pseudo white paper is coming out. Otherwise, I think we'll set up for the next presentation. But thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.